When they commanded me to sing, his eyes held mine like a predator who'd finally found what he'd been hunting. The entire hall held its breath, suspended between my trembling voice and his absolute stillness. I knew in that crystalline moment that nothing would ever be the same, that the sound leaving my throat was either my salvation or my complete undoing. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The lights in the grand hall blazed like sharpened blades when they ordered me to the center of the room. Each chandelier seemed to mock me, their crystal teardrops catching the firelight and throwing it back in my face. My hands trembled at my sides and I clenched them into fists, trying to still the tremor that ran through my entire body. It wasn't the cold that made me shake. The hall was stifling, thick with the perfume of expensive oils and the acrid scent of power. It was the weight of their eyes, hundreds of them, all fixed on me with varying degrees of amusement, disgust, and anticipation. I was the Omega who served their wine, the girl who kept her eyes down and her mouth shut, the one they referred to as that creature when they thought I couldn't hear, though they never truly cared whether I could or not. I had no family name to speak of, no lineage that mattered in their golden books. I was entertainment, a curiosity they'd decided to parade before themselves like a trained animal. And they wanted me to fail. The women, draped in silks that cost more than I would see in a lifetime, whispered behind jeweled fans. Their laughter was delicate, practiced, designed to cut without seeming cruel. One of them, Lady Cassandra, with her ice-blonde hair and eyes like chips of frozen lake, made a gesture as if shooing away an insect. The message was clear. I was beneath them, barely worthy of acknowledgement, and certainly not capable of producing anything beautiful. The men were worse in their own way. They leaned back in their chairs, goblets of deep red wine in their hands, expressions ranging from bored indifference to predatory interest. One of the young lords, I didn't know his name, they all blurred together in their finery, smirked at his companion and said something that made them both laugh. The sound harsh and grating, the piano began, its notes cold and mechanical, played by a musician who clearly resented being part of this spectacle. I closed my eyes for just a moment, trying to find something inside myself to hold on to. My mother's face blurred by time and grief, the memory of a lullaby she used to sing back when I still believed the world might be kind. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, some other girl who hadn't learned yet what cruelty could be dressed up as tradition. There was no escape. The doors were guarded, and even if they weren't, where would I go? This castle, this kingdom, this entire world was built on a hierarchy that placed me at the very bottom. Running would only make it worse. So I opened my mouth and sang. The first note came out trembling, uncertain, and I heard the ripple of satisfaction move through the crowd. They wanted this, wanted to see me struggle to prove that I was exactly what they believed me to be. But then something inside me shifted. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was the realization that I had nothing left to lose. Maybe it was simply that the pain I'd been carrying for so long finally found a voice. The song changed. It stopped being about technique or perfection and became something raw, something that seemed to claw its way out of my chest. I sang of loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. I sang of hunger, not for food, but for a single moment of gentleness in a world made of sharp edges. I sang of nights spent crying into thin blankets, of days spent invisible, of a hope that refused to die no matter how many times it should have. The hall fell silent. Even the whispers died. I felt it. Felt the moment they stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped existing as anything but listeners. The power of it terrified me, this sudden command I had over them, and I almost stopped. But I couldn't. The song had taken on a life of its own, and I was merely the vessel through which it poured. Then I heard it, the sound of boots on marble, measured and deliberate, each footstep resonating through the hall like a heartbeat. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I felt every person around me shift, straighten, their casual cruelty transforming into rigid formality. The king had arrived. I'd never seen him before. Omegas like me weren't permitted in the throne room, weren't allowed anywhere near the corridors of real power. I knew him only through whispers and rumors, that he was ruthless, that he was brilliant, that he'd taken the throne at 19 and held it through sheer force of will, that he'd never taken a mate, never shown interest in anyone, that his bed remained cold and empty by choice. The piano stuttered, missing a note as the musician scrambled to his feet and bowed. Everyone in the hall bowed, a wave of submission that rippled through the crowd. Everyone except me. I couldn't move. My legs had locked, my body frozen in place, and all I could do was keep singing because stopping felt like it would shatter something vital inside me. I felt his gaze before I saw him. It was like being touched by flame, not burning but undeniably present, impossible to ignore. A heat that sank beneath my skin and wrapped around my lungs, making each breath an effort. My voice wavered for just a moment and then steadied, driven by something I didn't understand. When I finally dared to look, to see the man whose presence had transformed the entire room, I understood why they spoke of him in hushed tones. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too sharp, too severe, all hard angles and uncompromising lines. His jaw looked carved from granite, his nose had been broken at least once, and a thin scar traced its way from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. His hair was dark as midnight. Pulled back from his face and his eyes, God. His eyes were the colour of storm clouds, grey and churning with something that might have been hunger or fury or both. But it was his presence that truly commanded. He moved like violence contained, like a blade that had chosen for now to remain sheathed. Every line of his body spoke of power, of certainty, of a man who had never once questioned his right to rule. He wore black, unadorned, except for the silver crown that sat on his brow. Not the ornate, jewelled thing I'd imagined, but something simpler, more brutal, like a circlet of thorns transformed to metal. He stopped at the edge of the dance floor, perhaps 20 feet from where I stood, close enough that I could see the way his pupils dilated as he stared at me. Close enough that I could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. Close enough that when he spoke, his voice wrapped around me like smoke. Continue. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even truly a command. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that made my bones ache and my heart stutter in my chest. A voice that suggested the universe itself would rearrange to accommodate his will. I sang. God help me, I sang for him, and it was different now. The pain was still there, but underneath it ran something else. Recognition, perhaps. As if some part of me, some ancient buried thing, knew him. Knew the taste of his power, the weight of his gaze. As if we'd met before in some other life, some other world. And this was merely a remembering. The song built toward its crescendo, my voice climbing higher, breaking in places but somehow more beautiful for the breaking. And he didn't look away, not once. His eyes held mine with such intensity that the rest of the room ceased to exist. There was only him, only this, only the sound of my voice filling the space between us. When the final note faded into silence, the hall remained frozen. I could hear the candles guttering in their holders, could hear the rustle of fabric as someone shifted their weight, could hear my own heart thundering so loudly I was certain everyone must hear it too. He moved toward me, each step deliberate, measured. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's bow. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body through the heavy fabric of his clothes. So close I could smell him. Leather and steel and something darker, something that made my mouth go dry and my knees weak. His eyes traveled over my face, my throat, my trembling hands. It wasn't the hungry, degrading examination of the nobles who sometimes looked at Omega girls with thoughts of temporary amusement. This was something else entirely. This was evaluation, assessment, the look of a predator determining whether its prey was worth the hunt. Your name. His voice was quieter now, but no less commanding. It rumbled through me, vibrating in my chest. My throat was dry. I had to swallow twice before I could speak. They told me I don't have one worth remembering, Your Majesty. A murmur ran through the hall, scandalized and thrilled. I'd spoken to him, answered him honestly instead of with the practiced deference they expected. Lady Cassandra's fan snapped shut with an audible crack. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close. The corner of his mouth lifted by perhaps a millimeter, and somehow that tiny movement transformed his entire face from severe to devastating. Then they will create one, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall. because I do not forget faces that defy fear. The room erupted. I could feel the shock, the outrage, the jealousy radiating from the nobles like heat from a fire. He didn't acknowledge any of it. His eyes remained on me, pinning me in place, and I felt something shift in the air between us. Something ancient and inevitable, like the pull of the tide toward the moon. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The crowd closed behind him, and I was left standing alone in the center of the hall, my heart racing and my hands still trembling. But for entirely different reasons now. I'd become the scandal of the night. The Omega who'd dared to sing, who'd caught the king's attention, who'd been promised a name by the one man whose word could not be questioned. The ladies declared it a curse, a humiliation disguised as favor. The lords called it insolence, Omega arrogance that would be corrected soon enough. No one wanted to admit what they'd all seen, that the king, the man who'd never stopped for anyone, had stood transfixed by a voice they'd all dismissed as worthless. They said I'd bewitched him. That something profane had passed between us in those charged moments. All I knew was that when I'd looked into his eyes, the ground had ceased to exist beneath my feet, and I was still falling. The days that followed were strange, suspended between nightmare and dream. The castle buzzed with rumors, each more elaborate than the last. The servants whispered when I passed, their voices carrying just enough for me to hear. Usurper, they called me, shadow girl. The king's temporary fascination. They avoided me in the corridors, pressed themselves against the walls when I approached, as if my presence might contaminate them. But they listened. Oh, they listened. Every time I moved, every breath I took, I could feel their attention like insects crawling across my skin. Even the walls seemed to hold the echo of that night, of my voice filling the hall, of the king's command to continue. He didn't summon me, didn't send for me. I told myself I was relieved. Told myself that his interest had been momentary. A king's idle curiosity about an oddity, nothing more. But he was everywhere. In the windows that flew open to let in the cold wind. In the heavy silences during the servants' meals. In the burning memory of his voice. The way it had wrapped around my bones and settled there like it belonged. I began to understand that his gaze hadn't been mere fascination. It had been a brand, a claiming, even if he'd walked away. The castle knew it. The nobles knew it. And somewhere, buried beneath my fear and confusion, I knew it too. The summons came on a morning when frost covered the windows in delicate patterns like lace. One of the king's personal guards appeared at the servants' quarters, his face impassive as stone, and handed me a sealed letter. The other servants scattered like birds before a storm, leaving me alone to break the dark red wax. The king requires your presence in the library. Immediately. My hands shook as I read the words. The library. The one place in the entire castle where no one was permitted without explicit permission. Where ancient texts lined the walls and secrets were kept locked in glass cases. Where, it was said, the king spent his sleepless nights reading by candlelight. Alone with thoughts too dangerous to share. The chambermaids dressed me in silence, their fingers rough as they fastened the simple grey dress. I could see the fear in their eyes, though whether they feared for me or of me, I couldn't tell. One of them, an older woman named Margaret, who'd occasionally shown me small kindnesses, pressed a handkerchief into my palm. "Hold your head up," she whispered. "Don't let them see you break." The walk to the library felt endless. My escort, 2 guards who flanked me like I might bolt at any moment, said nothing, their faces carved from marble. We passed nobles who stopped mid-conversation to stare, their expressions ranging from shock to fury to something darker. Lady Cassandra stood near a window, her lips curved in a smile that promised retribution. The library doors were massive, carved oak that must have been centuries old, decorated with scenes of ancient battles. The guards pushed them open and gestured for me to enter alone. The doors closed behind me with a sound like a tomb ceiling. The room took my breath away. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, leather-bound volumes in every colour, their spines gleaming in the morning light that streamed through tall windows. The air smelled of old paper and beeswax and something else, something masculine and warm that I recognised immediately. He stood by one of the windows, his back to me, hands clasped behind him. The light carved his silhouette against the brightness, making him look less like a man and more like a shadow given form. He didn't turn when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. The silence stretched. I stood there, uncertain, my heart hammering against my ribs. Should I speak? Should I bow? I'd never been taught the proper protocol for being alone with a king, especially not this king, especially not after what had happened. Sing. His voice cut through the silence, still without turning. It wasn't harsh, but it left no room for refusal. Sing for me now. Your Majesty, I sing. This time the single word carried the weight of absolute authority. But underneath it I heard something else. Something that might have been desperation, though surely I was imagining it. Kings didn't desperately need anything from Omega servants, so I sang. Without the piano, without the audience, without anything but the morning light and his shadow and the thundering of my own pulse. I chose a different song this time, something older, something my mother had taught me before the fever took her. A lullaby about stars and lost loves and the promises the moon makes to the lonely. When the last note faded, he finally turned. The morning light behind him made it impossible to see his face clearly, but I felt the impact of his gaze like a physical touch. They mocked you, he said quietly, and it took me a moment to realize he was talking about that night, about the nobles and their cruel laughter. They still mock you. They whisper that you're nothing, that you've overstepped, that I'll tire of you by week's end and send you back to the kitchens where you belong. I said nothing. What could I say? He was probably right. He probably would tire of me. He moved closer, each step measured, and the light shifted to reveal his face. Those storm grey eyes held something I couldn't name, something between anger and wonder. What they call weakness, he said, his voice dropping lower, I recognize as strength. The fear is theirs, not yours. Do you understand that? I don't understand any of this, I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. I don't understand why you stopped. Why you listened. Why I'm here. He took another step forward, close enough now that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. This close, I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his pupils had dilated until the grey was nearly swallowed by black. This close, I could feel the heat of him, could smell leather and steel and something indefinably him. Be careful, little Omega, he said, and his voice was soft as silk and dangerous as poison. The sound of your voice may change what even I believed immutable. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to understand the way he looked at me like I was both salvation and damnation. But before I could form the words, he stepped back, and the spell, if that's what it had been, broke. You may go, he said, his voice once again the impersonal tone of command. But his eyes told a different story entirely. I fled. There was no other word for it. I turned and walked as quickly as I could without running, my hands trembling and my heart on fire. Behind me, I swear I heard him exhale, long and shaky as if he'd been holding his breath the entire time. The castle seemed to breathe with me as I made my way back through the corridors. The stone walls felt warm, alive, pulsing with something that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there and I'd simply never noticed, never dared to notice, until a king's gaze had awakened something sleeping inside me. I knew nothing would be the same, knew that something had shifted, some fundamental reality of my existence had been altered. I was still treated as a shadow, still avoided and whispered about, but now there was fear in their avoidance. Now there was uncertainty in their whispers. Because at every banquet, every formal gathering, the king's eyes would find me, would linger. And every time I was commanded to sing, and I was commanded often now, though never by him directly, his face would go still and watchful, and the entire room would feel the weight of his attention shifting from matters of state to the sound of my voice. The nobles raged in private. How dare an Omega, a nobody, a creature without lineage or value, capture the interest of their king? Lady Cassandra began a campaign of subtle cruelties, each one designed to remind me of my place. She'd spill wine on my dress right before I was expected to perform. She'd schedule me for the most degrading tasks. scrubbing chamber pots, emptying slop buckets, ensuring I'd arrive at formal gatherings exhausted and reeking. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. Because when I sang, when my voice filled whatever space I'd been commanded to fill, I watched his world crumble a little more. Watched the iron control he maintained over everything slip, just slightly. Watched the man who governed an entire kingdom become helpless before something he couldn't conquer or command or control. And I realized, slowly, terrifyingly, that this was power. Not the kind wielded with swords or crowns or decrees, but the kind that lived in vulnerability, in truth, in the willingness to break open and bleed where everyone could see. The nobles thought they were humiliating me by making me sing. They didn't understand that every time I opened my mouth, I bound their king a little more tightly to something he couldn't escape. This, then, was how my ruin began, and perhaps also the beginning of something that might be called power. The turning point came on a night when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky, turning everything silver. The castle was hosting an elaborate ball, some visiting dignitary from a neighbouring kingdom, treaties to be signed, alliances to be forged. The kind of political theatre that required everyone to don their finest masks and pretend civility. I'd been ordered to sing, of course. Lady Cassandra had made certain I spent the entire day scrubbing floors, ensuring I'd have barely enough time to make myself presentable. When I finally stumbled into the servants' quarters to change, my hands were raw and my back ached. And I had perhaps 15 minutes before I was expected in the grand ballroom. Margaret helped me, her weathered hands gentle as she brushed out my hair. "That Cassandra will answer for her cruelties someday," she muttered. "Mark my words, child. The universe keeps accounts." I didn't have the heart to tell her that the universe had never much cared about the accounts of Omega girls. The ballroom glittered with even more opulence than usual. Chandeliers dripped crystal, each one holding hundreds of candles that turned the space into something out of a fever dream. The nobles wore their finest, silks and velvets in jewel tones, gold thread catching the light, diamonds winking from throats and wrists and hair. They looked like exotic birds, beautiful and cruel. The king sat on a raised dais at the far end of the room, the visiting monarch, a thin, nervous man with twitching hands, beside him. They were deep in conversation, or at least the visiting king was talking, while our king listened with the patience of a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was announced, though barely. The herald's voice was dismissive, reducing me to entertainment for Her Majesty's pleasure. I walked to the centre of the ballroom floor, feeling every eye on me, feeling the weight of their contempt like stones. This time, they'd chosen the song for me, something old and complicated, with high notes that would strain any voice, especially one belonging to someone as exhausted as I was. It was designed to make me fail publicly, to prove once and for all that the king's interest was misplaced, that I was nothing special, the musicians began, and I closed my eyes, gathering what little strength I had left. The first note emerged shaky, uncertain, and I heard the rustle of satisfaction move through the crowd. But I pushed forward, climbing toward those impossible high notes, my voice cracking in places from exhaustion. "Pathetic," someone whispered. "Loud enough to carry." "The king will see now," another voice agreed. I opened my eyes and looked directly at him. He sat utterly still, his face unreadable, but his hands gripped the arms of his throne so tightly I could see his knuckles white even from this distance. Something in me snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was simply that I was tired of being tested, tired of being treated like an object instead of a person. Whatever it was, I stopped singing the song they'd chosen. Stopped mid-phrase, the abrupt silence shocking in its completeness. The ballroom erupted in scandalized whispers. I'd broken protocol, defied a direct order. This was grounds for punishment, possibly even imprisonment. But I didn't care. I was so tired of caring. Instead, I sang something else. The song my mother used to sing when she thought I was sleeping. The one about a girl who loved the moon so much she grew wings and flew away from a world that had never wanted her. It was simple, haunting, and it came from the deepest part of me. The whispers died. Even Lady Cassandra fell silent, because this wasn't performance. This was confession. A bearing of everything I'd kept hidden. I sang about loneliness, about watching from the shadows while others lived in the light, about the peculiar pain of being invisible and hypervisible at the same time, about wanting desperately to be seen, truly seen, by even one person. And I sang it directly to him, not because I was trying to seduce or manipulate, but because he was the only one in that room who'd ever looked at me like I was real. When I finished, the silence was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. The visiting monarch looked confused, glancing between me and our king, clearly unsure what had just happened. The king stood. The sound of his chair scraping against stone was thunder in that silence. He descended from the dais, each step deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. The crowd parted before him like he was Moses and they the Red Sea, and I thought, wildly, that this was it. This was when he'd reveal that his interest had been temporary amusement, when he'd put me back in my place. He stopped in front of me, reached up, and very deliberately, very gently, he touched my cheek with the back of his hand. The ballroom exploded. I heard gasps, outraged muttering, someone's glass shattering against the floor. But all I could focus on was the warmth of his skin against mine, the way his eyes had gone soft in a way I'd never seen, the slight tremor in his hand. "Enough," he said, and though his voice was quiet, it carried to every corner of the room. "Enough testing. Enough cruelty disguised as tradition. This Omega has more courage in her smallest finger than most of you possess in your entire bodies." Lady Cassandra stepped forward, her face twisted with rage barely contained beneath a veneer of concern. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. She's..." "What?" He turned to face her, and the temperature in the room dropped. "She's what, Cassandra? An Omega? Lowborn? Without family?" His voice was silk over steel. "Every criticism you level at her is also a criticism of the value I have chosen to see. Are you questioning my judgment?" Cassandra's face went white. "Of course not, Your Majesty. You merely sought to humiliate someone you considered beneath you," he finished. "You and everyone else in this room who participated in this evening's entertainment. You thought you were clever, giving her an impossible task. You thought you'd reveal her as a fraud." He turned back to me and his expression softened again. "But all you revealed was your own emptiness." He offered me his hand. Not a command, but a question. I stared at it. At the calluses on his palm from sword practice, at the faint scars across his knuckles. If I took it, everything would change. Whatever precarious existence I'd managed to carve out would be destroyed. I'd make enemies of every noble in this room, would paint a target on my back that I might never escape. I took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm and strong, and he lifted my hand to his lips. The kiss he pressed to my knuckles burned like a brand, and I heard several people gasp. This wasn't how kings treated Omegas. This wasn't how anyone treated Omegas. "You will be given quarters in the West Wing," he said, his voice carrying to the entire ballroom. "You will have servants of your own, dresses appropriate to your new station, and anything else you require. Anyone who treats you with anything less than the respect due to someone under my personal protection will answer directly to me." He released my hand but didn't step back, creating a barrier between me and the room of hostile stares. "This ball is concluded," he announced. "Everyone out, now." The scramble to obey was almost comical. Nobles tripped over their own finery in their haste to escape. The visiting monarch looking utterly baffled as he was hustled away by his attendants. Within minutes, the ballroom was empty except for the two of us and the lingering scent of expensive perfume and burning candles. Only then did he turn to face me fully, his mask of absolute authority slipping to reveal something more human underneath. Something vulnerable. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have stopped them sooner. Should have prevented..." "Why?" The word burst out of me before I could contain it. "Why do any of this? Why protect me? Why care about a..." "Don't." His voice was sharp. "Don't reduce yourself to what they've called you. You are not just anything. Then what am I?" I was trembling now from exhaustion and emotion and the sheer impossibility of this entire situation. "What am I to you?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching my face as if looking for something he'd lost. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw in a way I'd never heard from him. "I don't know yet," he admitted. But from the moment I heard you sing, from the moment I saw you standing in that hall with terror and defiance warring in your eyes, I knew you were important, knew you were going to change everything. I'm nobody, I whispered. I have nothing to offer you. No lands, no title, no political advantage. You have a voice that makes me remember I'm human, he interrupted. That makes me feel something beyond duty and crown and the weight of expectations. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? I couldn't speak. Couldn't process what he was saying, what it meant, what it would cost us both if he continued down this path. He reached out again, slower this time, and cupped my face in both his hands. His thumbs brushed across my cheekbones, gentle as a breath. I'm not asking you to love me, he said softly. I'm not even asking you to like me. I'm just asking you to stop letting them convince you that you're worthless, because you're not. And He stopped, his jaw clenching as if the words hurt to say. I cannot watch them destroy you. Won't watch it. They'll never accept this, I managed. They'll fight you, undermine you. Let them try. The dangerous edge was back in his voice. I've held this kingdom against worse threats than petty nobles with wounded pride. They'll learn to accept it, or they'll learn what happens to those who defy me. He dropped his hands and stepped back, and I felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. Go, he said, his voice once again the tone of command. Your new quarters are ready. Margaret will show you the way. Rest. Tomorrow, he trailed off, something like uncertainty crossing his face. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. I wanted to stay. Wanted to ask the 1,000 questions crowding my mind. Wanted to understand how a king could look at someone like me and see anything worth protecting. But I was so tired. My body and mind pushed beyond their limits, so I simply nodded and turned toward the doors. Wait. I stopped, looked back. He stood in the center of that enormous ballroom, surrounded by wealth and power and evidence of his absolute authority, and somehow he looked lonely, lost. Your mother's song, he said quietly, the one about flying to the moon. Sing it for me again sometime. When there's no audience, no expectations, just sing it. I will, I promised, and meant it. The quarters in the West Wing were absurd in their luxury. A bed large enough for 4 people draped in silk that felt like water under my fingertips. A fireplace that could have roasted an entire pig. Windows overlooking the castle gardens, where night-blooming flowers filled the air with their perfume. Margaret fussed over me, helping me out of my dress and into a nightgown of such fine linen it felt like wearing clouds. You've done something remarkable, she said, as she brushed out my hair. Something no one thought possible. I've made enemies of everyone, I replied, watching the fire flicker and dance. You've made them afraid, she corrected. And that's far more powerful. Sleep now, child. You'll need your strength for what's coming. What was coming turned out to be a war of subtle attrition. The nobles couldn't move against me directly, the king's protection saw to that, but they found 1,000 small ways to make their displeasure known. Servants who were supposed to attend me were suddenly unavailable. Invitations to social gatherings were mysteriously lost. The whispers followed me everywhere, creative speculation about what I must be doing to maintain the king's interest. Through it all, he remained frustratingly distant. I saw him at formal gatherings where his eyes would find me across crowded rooms and hold for just a moment too long before returning to matters of state. But he never summoned me again, never sought me out privately. It was as if that night in the ballroom had frightened him as much as it had frightened me. 3 weeks passed this way, 3 weeks of luxury and isolation, of being protected but not truly safe. I spent my days learning to navigate the treacherous waters of castle politics, my nights singing softly to myself in that enormous bedroom, wondering if he could hear me somewhere in the vast stone corridors. Then, on a night when storm clouds gathered and the first cold rain of autumn began to fall, there was a knock at my door. Not Margaret, not any of the servants. When I opened it, he stood there, rain-soaked despite the covered walkways, his hair falling loose around his face, his eyes wild. "May I come in?" he asked, and his voice was nothing like the commanding tone I'd grown accustomed to. It was uncertain, almost frightened. I stepped back and he entered, water dripping from his cloak onto my pristine floors. For a moment we just stared at each other, the storm raging outside my windows providing a soundtrack to whatever was about to happen. "I tried to stay away," he said finally. "Tried to convince myself that protecting you was enough, that I didn't need—" He stopped, dragged a hand through his wet hair. "I'm not good at this. At wanting things that aren't part of duty or responsibility or what's expected." "What do you want?" I asked softly. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw everything he'd been hiding. The loneliness, the bone-deep exhaustion of being a symbol instead of a person, the desperate need for something real in a world built on performance and politics. "You," he said simply. "I want you. Not to possess or control or keep like some prize, just you. Your voice, your courage, the way you look at me like I'm a person instead of a crown." He took a step closer. "But I won't take it. Won't demand it. You've spent your whole life being told what to do, what to be, how to serve. I won't add to that burden." My heart was thundering so loudly I could barely hear the storm. "And if I wanted you to?" I whispered. "What then?" "Then we'd be two people choosing each other against the wisdom of kingdoms," he said with a ghost of a smile. "Two people deciding that maybe, possibly, what they want matters as much as what they should want." I closed the distance between us, reached up, and touched his face the way he'd touched mine in the ballroom. His skin was cold from the rain, but under my palm I could feel the warmth rising, could feel the tremor that ran through him at my touch. "I can't promise you easy," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They'll fight this. They'll call you names, question your motives, suggest things that will hurt. And I'm not always kind. I'm demanding and cold, and I've forgotten how to be gentle." "I don't need easy," I replied. "And I'm not afraid of demanding. I'm afraid of being invisible again, of being nothing." "You could never be nothing," he said fiercely. "Not to me." He kissed me then, and it was nothing like the courtly kisses I'd seen at formal events, practiced and performative. This was desperate, searching, like he was trying to memorize the taste of me. His hands cradled my face with a gentleness that contradicted everything I'd heard about him. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. "Stay," I said, the word barely audible. "I shouldn't. I know. Stay anyway." So he did. We sat by the fire, his head in my lap, while I sang every song I knew, my mother's lullabies and bawdy tavern songs and hymns I'd learned from the castle chapel. His eyes drifted closed, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked peaceful, young almost despite the weight he carried. "Tell me something true," I said softly, my fingers carding through his drying hair. "I haven't slept properly in years," he admitted, his eyes still closed. "Not since I took the crown. Every night is strategy and contingency planning, and wondering what crisis will come next. And tonight? Tonight I'm just a man," he said. "Just someone who found something unexpected and precious and terrifying." We fell asleep like that, tangled together in front of the fire, his arm wrapped around my waist and my hand in his hair. It was innocent and intimate and more romantic than anything I'd ever imagined. When I woke to grey morning light, he was already dressed, standing by the window. But when he heard me stir, he turned, and the smile he gave me transformed his entire face. "I have a council meeting," he said. 3 trade disputes and a border skirmish that needs addressing. But tonight..." He paused, something uncertain flickering across his face. "Tonight, would you have dinner with me? Just us, no audience, no performance, just dinner." "I'd like that," I said. He crossed to where I sat, bent down and kissed my forehead with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "Until tonight, then." After he left, I sat in the growing light and marveled at how much could change in a single night. Yesterday I'd been protected but alone. Today I was something else entirely. Something that had no name yet but felt like possibility. The castle's reaction was immediate and explosive. By midday, everyone knew the king had spent the night in my quarters. The whispers turned to open speculation, the hostility to barely concealed rage. Lady Cassandra looked ready to commit murder, her face twisted with fury every time she saw me. But there was something else too. A shift in the way certain people looked at me. Less like an aberration and more like a threat. Because if an Omega with no family and no power could capture a king's heart, what did that say about the careful hierarchies they'd built their lives upon? The dinner that night was everything he'd promised. Just the two of us in a small private dining room I hadn't known existed. Candles casting warm light. Simple food that actually tasted like something instead of the overwrought dishes served at formal events. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up with the weight of expectation, about losing his parents young and having to learn kingship while still grieving. I told him about my mother, about the years of scrubbing floors and remaining invisible, about the songs that kept me sane. "I need you to understand something," he said as the evening wound down. It won't be easy. The council will oppose a formal courtship. The nobles will make your life hell. There are laws, traditions, expectations about who a king should choose." "I know," I said quietly. "But I don't care," he continued, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I've spent my entire life doing what was expected, what was proper, what was best for the kingdom. And I was good at it. I am good at it. But I was also empty. And then you sang, and I remembered what it felt like to want something just for myself." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you're willing to weather the storm with me, I want to see where this goes. Properly. Courting you the way you deserve, slowly and carefully. He stopped, swallowed hard. "I want to know if what I feel now is real or just the novelty of something different. And I want you to have the same chance to decide if I'm worth the trouble I'll bring into your life." It was honest. Terrifyingly honest. And I loved him for it. "Okay," I said simply. His smile was like sunrise. "Okay." The courtship that followed defied every convention. He was supposed to court someone with lands and title, someone who could bring political advantage. Instead, he courted a girl who brought him songs and honesty, and the kind of love that wasn't calculated or strategic. He took me riding in the early mornings, before the castle fully woke, teaching me to sit a horse properly while laughing at my initial terror. We walked in the gardens at night, his hand warm in mine, talking about everything from philosophy to the best way to make bread. He had me sit in on council meetings, valuing my perspective even when, especially when, it differed from his advisors. And I sang for him constantly, in corridors and gardens and his private chambers. Songs that made him laugh and songs that made him think and songs that made him pull me close and kiss me like I was air and he was drowning. 3 months passed this way. 3 months of falling deeper into something that felt inevitable and right and terrifying. The nobles' opposition hadn't lessened, but we'd learned to navigate it together. He'd dismissed 2 council members who'd been particularly hostile, promoted several younger nobles who seemed more open-minded, and made it clear that his personal life was not up for debate. Then came the winter solstice ball, and everything changed again. The ballroom was decorated in silver and white, candles everywhere, the air thick with expectation. All the noble families had gathered, along with visiting dignitaries from neighbouring kingdoms. It was the social event of the season, the kind of gathering where alliances were forged and futures decided. I wore a dress he'd had made for me, deep midnight blue that made my skin glow, embroidered with silver stars. When I'd seen it, I'd cried. No one had ever given me something so beautiful, so specifically mine. The evening progressed normally at first. Dancing, conversations, political maneuvering disguised as small talk. I stayed near his side, learning to read the complex dynamics of court politics, occasionally adding quiet observations that made him smile. Then, as midnight approached, he stood. The room fell silent immediately, hundreds of eyes turning toward the dais where he stood bathed in candlelight. "Tonight, on the longest night of the year, I want to share something with you," he began, his voice carrying to every corner. "For years, I've ruled as you've expected, pragmatically, strategically, putting the needs of the kingdom above any personal desire. I've made decisions based on logic and tradition, and I don't regret that. It made us strong." He paused, his eyes finding mine across the room. "But strength without heart is just cruelty with a different name. Power without compassion is tyranny, and a king who forgets he's human first becomes a monster in a crown." Lady Cassandra looked suspicious, several other nobles openly confused. The visiting dignitaries leaned forward, sensing something significant. 3 months ago, I met someone who reminded me what it means to be brave. Not brave in battle or in politics, but brave in the deepest sense. The courage to be vulnerable, to stand exposed before the world, and still sing your truth." He descended from the dais, walking slowly through the crowd that parted before him. "She's taught me that worth isn't measured in bloodlines or gold. That value comes from integrity, from resilience, from the willingness to keep trying even when everything says you'll fail." He stopped in front of me, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "I'm not asking you to understand," he said, addressing the room but looking only at me. "I'm not asking for permission or approval. I'm simply telling you, all of you, that I'm choosing her. Choosing this. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." He turned back to the crowd, his voice hardening into the tone of command I knew so well. "Tomorrow I'll announce formal courtship. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to voice their concerns directly to me. But I warn you now, I've made my decision, and I do not make decisions lightly." The ballroom erupted. Some applauded, though whether out of genuine support or political calculation was impossible to say. Others looked furious, scandalized. Lady Cassandra's face had gone purple with rage. But through it all, he stood beside me, his hand finding mine and holding tight. Later, alone in my quarters, I finally let myself process what had happened. "You've painted an enormous target on both our backs," I said quietly. "I know. They'll never forgive this. Never forget. I know that too." He pulled me close, resting his forehead against mine. "But I'm tired of living for their approval. Tired of being what they expect instead of who I am. And who I am, apparently, is someone who fell in love with an Omega who sings like she's calling down stars." My breath caught. "You love me?" "Desperately," he admitted. "Terrifyingly. In a way that probably isn't wise or strategic or anything a king should feel, but yes, I love you." "I love you too," I whispered, and felt him shudder against me. We were married 3 months later in a small ceremony that scandalized half the kingdom and inspired the other half. I didn't become queen. The laws wouldn't allow that. Not for someone of my status, but I became his consort, his partner, the person who stood beside him through every decision. The nobles adjusted, slowly, grudgingly. Some never did, clinging to their prejudices until they died bitter and alone. But others, younger ones mostly, who'd grown tired of rigid hierarchies, began to see possibility in what we represented. I learned to navigate court politics, learned to use my voice as a weapon and a tool. When visiting dignitaries came, I sang for them, and they left understanding that this kingdom valued things beyond power and gold. When domestic disputes arose, I sat in on meetings, offering perspectives that helped my husband see solutions he'd otherwise missed. And at night, when the crown was set aside and the weight of kingship temporarily lifted, we were just 2 people who'd found each other against all odds. 2 people who chose each other every single day, regardless of what tradition or expectation or careful political calculation said they should do. Years later, when historians wrote about his reign, they called it the Golden Years. They talked about the reforms he implemented, the prosperity that grew, the way the kingdom evolved from rigid hierarchies into something more fluid, more human. They debated his policies and strategies, analysed his decisions, examined his legacy. But they never quite understood the role I played. How a girl who'd been nothing, who'd been invisible, had taught a king to see differently. How my voice, the one they'd mocked and dismissed, had changed the fundamental nature of power in our world. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we'd sit by the fire and remember that first ball, the humiliation and terror and the moment everything changed. He'd ask me to sing that old lullaby, the one about flying to the moon, and I'd watch his face soften in the candlelight. But our story wasn't without its trials. The greatest test came in our 3rd year together, when the northern provinces threatened rebellion and the council demanded he prove his strength through violence. They gathered in the war room, maps spread across ancient oak tables, discussing strategies and casualties as if lives were merely numbers to be calculated. I wasn't supposed to be there. Women, especially Omega consorts, were excluded from military decisions. But I'd learned to navigate the hidden passages of the castle, the servants' corridors that ran like veins through stone. I positioned myself behind a tapestry, listening as they laid out their plans. "The Northern Lords see your marriage as weakness," Lord Blackwood said, his voice heavy with judgment. "They think sentiment has made you soft. A show of force is necessary. Burn 3 villages, execute the ringleaders publicly, remind them why they should fear you. My blood ran cold. The northern provinces were hungry, desperate, pushed to breaking by 3 years of drought and taxes they couldn't afford. They weren't rebels. They were survivors trying to feed their children. And if I refuse? My husband's voice was measured, controlled, but I heard the tension underneath. Then you risk appearing weak, another councillor added. Other provinces will follow. Your kingdom will fracture, and all because you've let an Omega soften your resolve. The words hung in the air like poison. I felt the familiar shame trying to claw its way up my throat, the voice that said they were right, that I'd made him vulnerable, that my presence was destroying everything he'd built. Then I heard him stand, the scrape of his chair echoing in the sudden silence. "Get out," he said quietly. "All of you. Your Majesty." "Out!" The word cracked like thunder, and I heard the scramble of boots, the rustle of robes, the muttered protests that died before fully forming. When the heavy doors slammed shut, the silence was absolute. "I know you're there," he said after a moment, and I heard the exhaustion in his voice. "Behind the eastern tapestry. You can come out." I emerged slowly, shame and defiance warring inside me. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "Don't." He turned to face me, and I saw the weight of impossible choices carved into every line of his face. "Don't apologize for caring, for wanting to understand." He moved to the window, staring out at the kingdom he was expected to terrorize into submission. "They're right, you know. About the perception. About how choosing you has made some see me as weak." "Then maybe—" "No." He turned back sharply. "Don't even think it. Don't suggest leaving or stepping back or any of the noble, self-sacrificing nonsense you're considering. I can see it in your eyes. But if I'm the reason they doubt you—" "You're not the reason," he interrupted, closing the distance between us. "Their own fear is the reason. Their inability to imagine power that doesn't come from cruelty is the reason. And if I respond to the North with violence, if I prove my strength through bloodshed, what does that make me?" "A king who protects his throne," I said quietly. "A tyrant who forgot why the throne matters." He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the turmoil I saw in his eyes. "You've taught me that power isn't just about making people fear you. It's about making them believe in something better. And the North doesn't need my violence. They need my help." "The council will never agree." "Then I'll go around the council." A smile ghosted across his lips, dangerous and determined. "I'll go to the North myself, talk to them, listen to them, find out what they actually need instead of what my advisors assume they need." "That's incredibly dangerous," I breathed. "If they see it as an opportunity, then I'll have to trust that they're as desperate for peace as I am." He pressed his forehead to mine, and I felt him trembling slightly. "Come with me. Let them see that the king they think has gone soft actually has the courage to stand unarmed before those who could destroy him. Let your voice be heard where it matters most." The journey north took 12 days, and with each mile the tension among our small escort grew thicker. The guards expected ambush at every turn. The remaining councillors who'd insisted on accompanying us muttered constantly about the foolishness of this mission, about how we were delivering ourselves into enemy hands. But when we finally reached the northern capital, a city worn thin by hardship, its buildings in need of repair and its people gaunt with hunger, there was no ambush. Just hundreds of frightened faces, people who'd heard their king was coming and didn't know whether to hope or despair. He insisted we meet them in the town square rather than in whatever passed for a lord's hall. No throne, no elevated platform, no barrier between ruler and ruled. Just him standing in the center of the square with me at his side, facing people who had every reason to hate us. The northern leader, a woman named Mara with silver streaking her dark hair and eyes that had seen too much loss, stepped forward. The crowd tensed. hands moving toward concealed weapons. My husband didn't flinch. "You came," Mara said, and her voice carried equal parts suspicion and disbelief. "They said you wouldn't. Said you'd send soldiers instead." "My counselors suggested exactly that," he replied honestly. "Suggested I burn villages and execute leaders to remind you of my power. I chose to come remind you of my humanity instead." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mara's eyes narrowed. Pretty words, but words don't feed children or fix wells poisoned by drought. "No," he agreed, "which is why I'm here to listen. To understand what you actually need instead of what distant counselors think you need. I'm here to ask, not demand, what would help your people survive and eventually thrive." For a long moment, Mara simply stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound. "You're either the bravest king I've ever heard of or the most foolish." "Probably both," he admitted, and something in his honesty made her smile fade into something more genuine. "We need the taxes reduced," she said finally. "Not eliminated. We understand governance costs, but reduced to something we can actually pay without starving. We need help repairing infrastructure the drought destroyed. We need grain stores to see us through until our own harvest recovers. And we need," she paused, glancing at her people, "we need to know we matter, that we're not just resources to be extracted from, but people worth protecting." "Done," he said simply. "Just like that?" "Just like that." He turned to address the entire square, his voice carrying to every corner. "I won't pretend my kingdom has been perfect. Won't pretend that distant governance hasn't sometimes forgotten the human cost of policies made in comfortable rooms far from struggle. But I'm here now, and I'm listening. My consort, and I will, stay for the next week, visiting villages, talking to families, understanding exactly what you need. And when we return to the capital, things will change." "Why should we believe you?" someone shouted from the crowd. He could have cited his authority, his power, his ability to enforce his will. Instead, he looked at me, and I understood what he was asking. I stepped forward, my heart thundering but my voice steady. Because 3 years ago, I was nothing. An Omega servant who scrubbed floors and stayed invisible. Your king could have chosen anyone. Noble ladies with lands and armies and political advantages. He chose me because I sang honestly about pain and hope and refusing to disappear. And he spent every day since trying to build a kingdom where worth isn't measured by birth or status, but by courage and integrity. If he'll do that for one invisible girl, imagine what he'll do for an entire province of people he's sworn to protect. The silence that followed was profound. Then slowly Mara bowed. Not the deep, submissive bow of fear, but the respectful nod of one leader acknowledging another. "A week then," she said. "Let's see if your actions match your words." They did. We spent 7 days in the north, and they were the most exhausting, illuminating days of my life. We visited farmhouses where families shared their last bread with us. We inspected wells that had run dry and fields that drought had turned to dust. We listened to stories of loss and resilience, of communities that had held together through impossible circumstances. And every evening, in whatever space we'd been given to rest, I sang. Not the courtly songs I'd learned, but the working songs people knew, songs about harvest and hope and enduring through darkness. Gradually others joined in, their voices rough with emotion, harmonizing with mine, creating something that felt like healing. When we finally left, people lined the roads, not to celebrate or to bow, but simply to see us off, to acknowledge that something had shifted, that maybe, just maybe, their king had remembered they existed. The council was furious when we returned. Lord Blackwood demanded to know how we'd dare make promises without their approval, how we'd risk appearing weak, how we'd set a precedent that would encourage every province to threaten rebellion. My husband listened patiently, his face expressionless. When they finally ran out of words, he stood. The northern provinces will have their tax reduction, he said calmly. Grain stores will be sent immediately. Infrastructure repair will begin next month. Anyone who has a problem with this is welcome to explain to me why keeping our own people desperate and angry serves the kingdom's interests. Your Majesty, this sets a dangerous precedent. Good, he interrupted. Let it set a precedent that this kingdom responds to need with help rather than violence, that we solve problems through listening rather than intimidation, that we govern with wisdom instead of fear. His voice hardened. And anyone who can't adapt to that new precedent should consider whether they're suited to continue serving on my council. 3 councillors resigned within the week. 2 more were dismissed for continuing to undermine the northern policies. But younger voices rose to fill those spaces, people who'd watched what happened in the north and saw possibility in it. The northern provinces didn't just survive, they thrived. 2 years later, their harvest was the strongest in a generation, and when other provinces faced their own crises, the north sent aid without being asked. They became the model for how the kingdom could function when governance remembered its humanity. And I learned something crucial during those days in the north. My voice didn't just have power when I sang, it had power when I spoke truth, when I stood beside my husband as a partner rather than an ornament, when I refused to be invisible even in spaces that weren't designed for someone like me. The nobles who'd never accepted our marriage grudgingly acknowledged that perhaps the Omega consort had value beyond what they'd imagined. Not because I'd suddenly gained status or title, but because I'd proven that different kinds of strength matter. That vulnerability can be powerful. That choosing compassion over cruelty isn't weakness, but the hardest kind of courage. Do you regret it? I asked my husband one night, back in our chambers, the northern crisis behind us. Choosing me over all the advantages you could have had? He pulled me close, kissed my temple, and smiled. Every single advantage they offered me felt like a cage, he said. You offered me wings, so no. Never regret. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Now, as this story draws to its close, I want to thank you for journeying with us through this tale of finding power in vulnerability, of discovering that true strength comes not from conforming to expectations, but from having the courage to defy them. If this story touched your heart, if you found something of yourself in these struggles and triumphs, I invite you to join our community. Click that like button to let me know this resonated with you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or which moment moved you most. And subscribe so you don't miss future stories about finding your voice in a world that tries to silence it. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more tales of courage, love, and transformation with you.